Let's talk about how you're going to do your plumbing to your utility sink. First thing I recommend is to do a drawing, just a hand sketch like you see here. Here's another example of a rough sketch I did. And you're going to use this to figure out your path, design in any additional components that you may want, like timers or hose connections, and also to get a supplies list so that when you go buy what you need, you have everything. You don't have to go back and forth. So here's the final layout for the plumbing of my utility sink. First thing you want to do is lay out the components in your area that you're going to be hooking up your plumbing. Here's a window. Here's where I installed my utility sink, a sewer clean out, my electrical outlet, my AC outdoor unit, and a hose spool that I'm going to be moving from here to here. Next, you want to identify all the points of water connection. For example, here's my utility sink water connection. This is my outdoor water supply spigot. These are going to be hose connections for my timers that run an irrigation system throughout my yard and my garden. And then this over here is where I'm going to tie in additional hose. Now that you've identified your points of connection, now you want to draw in essentially your pipe or your lines. So first you're going to draw your line from your water source to your utility sink. Now some of you, this may be your only water connection, but for me, I have additional. It's really simple. You're going to connect to the hose spigot with a female hose thread. Then I'm going to have a backflow preventer and a pressure regulator. You come down here. If you have one line, you're just going to 90 over. This is going to be a shut-off valve. And then you're going to 90 up. And then for me, because mine has a T connection, it's going to 90 back into the faucet. So one of the things I wanted to accomplish was in the winter, I wanted things to self-drain. That's why you see a slope at the furthest connection here going all the way down and to a T and essentially a ball valve right here that I can open. So I'll turn off the water, open all my valves, and then open this valve, and the water will back drain down out. It'll back drain here. This will be sloped back out to this point, and this will back drain out. In addition to this, in the winter, I pressure my irrigation lines with air to essentially try to purge them of water so that things don't freeze and bust. So I have two hose timers. One's for my garden and one is for my trees. I have a third port here so that I can connect my air, back pressure these lines by closing this valve and forcing any additional water that's in those lines out. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is the placement of your valves for isolation. This is really important because this will kind of dictate how you use your piping system. First thing you want to do is put valves so that you can isolate each water supply. For example, there's a valve here to isolate this hose, valve on each of these connections, and then a valve here for my utility tub. Next, you want to add your valves so that you have the ability to isolate and move water where you want to. For example, in the winter, I don't use this side of my piping system. I'm really just going to use my outdoor sink because I'm not gardening and I'm not needing to water my trees or my garden. I want a isolation valve here to isolate this side of the piping system. The other valve that I'm going to put in is this valve for drainage. You may not have this in your system, but I'm going to try to gravity drain my system. Lastly, I'm going to make sure I have all the valving so that when I air pressurize my irrigation system, I don't backfeed any of the air into any of these other components. So for example, I will connect my air here. This will force air back and down these two irrigation lines. But I don't want this air to really go back over here. So I can close this isolation valve here, and I can close this isolation valve and essentially isolate these two timers by themselves. So lastly, once you figure out your points of connection and how this is going to be laid out, do a fitting count. And so let's take this area, for example. I will have a male hose thread connection here, so I can connect to my garden hose. Then I will have a ball valve so that I can isolate this area. And then coming down, I'll have my pipe into another 90 connection pipe back over to a T connection, and then if I continue along here, I have another ball valve for isolation, a T connection, my backflow preventer, and a pressure regulator, and then a female hose thread connection. So now that you have all your connections, valves, and devices drawn in, you can go ahead and make a shopping list so that when you go to purchase everything, you know that you've identified each component within the system. So I want to show you two modifications that I made on my piping system that I've showed you so far. First, I moved my pressure reducing valve from my main water supply and moving it to both my timer outlets. The reason being is that I don't need reduced pressure at my faucet in my hose location. I need a reduced pressure at my irrigation system. The reason for that is because some of the devices that you use to emit water are only rated for a certain amount of pressure, and you don't want to overpressurize them or you'll ruin them. So the second thing I want to talk to you about is filtration. Some of you may be asking, well, if I'm just running a utility sink, do I need filtration? In my opinion, no. And the reason being is that in a typical home, you don't have a filtration system added to like your kitchen or bathroom sink. The reason I have a filter being added on this line here is because, again, with my irrigation system, there are certain emitters have really small orifices, and so those can get plugged very easily. So it's best that you add a filter to your system, your irrigation system, to prevent those water emitters to be plugged up. So this is going to be the fitting layout for running from my water supply to my utility sink. First, I'm going to connect to my water supply with a backflow preventer, a female hose thread, into a 90 because the spigot comes out from the wall at an angle, so I have to angle back towards the wall. Then I'm going into this T connection. This way is to my timers and hose. This is my shutoff valve, another T into a valve for draining the water out of my system, back into a 90 to get at the right angle to connect to the utility sink. This is the layout for the final run of fittings to hook up my irrigation system and my garden hose. So we already connected our utility tub from the main water supply here going this way. Now we're going to continue off the T. I put in a ball valve, which I'm not shown here but I already installed. That goes over to the T that goes up to my irrigation manifold and then goes this way to the garden hose. So the way I did the manifold is I'm going to have a T with a shutoff valve and a male hose thread. So the first thing to do is to continue from the ball valve here, the piping incline all the way to this 90 so that I have a continual decrease going this way to my drain that's at this end. Here's my final manifold setup. Over here I've got my filter, my drip irrigation for my trees, my drip irrigation for my vegetable garden, and always add another hose connection because you never know when you'll need it. Here is the final setup for my utility sink. As you can see over here, I have my shutoff valve, comes down to my drain line, and then in my utility sink, I've got my faucet with my hose sprayer, a stopper, a little bit of soap, and on the bottom, I have my drain with the bucket. So if I want to reuse that water, or I could just dump it straight to my septic.